Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken.
So thank you again for that, Brian. And Zach, if you want to just maybe briefly introduce yourself.
Great. So I'm going to try to make this talk not rely solely on my visuals, but every time I've been invited to talk, this has sort of been the theme of my presentations as of late. It's the title is just called No Blood Our Own, and the subtitle is Moving Toward a Sacrificial Approach to Two Kingdoms Peacemaking. And I'll just thank you again for the invitation. I welcome all feedback, because it's kind of been my passion project over the last 2 years, is just doing a lot of thinking and researching into what Christian peacemaking is. So just as a short introduction, my name is Zack Johnson. I'm the Dean of Students at Sattler College. And our tagline there is Equipping Jesus, Peaceful Revolution, Light the World Through Relational Discipleship and Academic Excellence. And over the past 3 years, I've been working at Sattler closely with a man in this picture named Finney Caravilla. He's the founder of Sattler and also a dear friend and mentor, and I would just say a spiritual mentor in my life. In this picture, this was spring of 2017 at my trial to leave the U.S. Air Force, where Finney was a witness in the case, where I kind of stood up before a military lawyer and had to go through the whole process of leaving the military. So I sort of framed my talk with this because 3 years ago I was about to go into a very different life. I was living a very different life, but I'm very passionate about peacemaking, and especially after encountering sort of a different perspective of Christ and how we should think about peacemaking here. So that's just a quick background into my last few years. I'm also married now and live in Boston, and I'm expecting my first child in February. So a lot is changing for me. So a couple years ago, a group of students and I think three students, we just tried to answer this basic question of what are the guiding principles, models, and metrics of biblical peacemaking grounded in two kingdoms perspective, striving for holistic peace in individual communities. And as you can imagine, if you go and do a Google search for peacemaking or peacekeeping, you'll get about a couple 100,000 hits, and you have no real idea on where to start and how to tackle this question. So we worked pretty hard to just do as much reading as we can, doing a lot of interviews. So what I'm going to try to show you today is just a quick summary of the last 2 years of what I've been doing. I also spent the last 2 summers down at a college called Eastern Mennonite University doing their grad work in what they call conflict transformation. This is just a plug. A lot of people, when they hear that I work at Sattler, they're like, hey, you guys are going to turn into somewhere like Eastern Mennonite. So I decided to go find out for myself what we're headed towards, and just doing a lot of research and thinking into what they're teaching down there. And I feel like I've wrapped my head pretty well around their framework for their worldview and things like that. So we've done a lot of reading from books. Lisa Shirk is sort of the main book that EMU's Center for Peace Building and Justice, they prescribe that to all their students. I've tried to map some research out into a book called When Helping Hurts. That's by a man named Steve Corbett and Bryant Fickert. There's sort of two Christians who have studied the poverty alleviation world and tried to distill the Christian principles of why the general world is getting poverty alleviation wrong. And then there's a man named John Paul Lederich. He wrote a book called The Moral Imagination. He's really well known. If you Google like peacemaking, you'll probably fall on his research. He's within the MCC or MCUSA world. And then there's just a bunch of different things I've done here. And then obviously there's a biblical basis for peacemaking in starting in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, Ephesians 2, James 3 through 4, 1 Peter, Romans. And I am more convinced than ever that Jesus in his Beatitudes, when he was describing those Beatitudes, that it wasn't simply a description of blessings, but it was a prescription that Jesus is calling us to be peacemakers and calling us into the areas of the world where there is conflict, and not necessarily just saying, oh, it thumbs up to you who choose to be peacemakers. I think it's a very prescriptive model in the Beatitudes there. And then we've been able to do a lot of interviews with some of these authors, and I'll just go over some of this. So I think in general, what I think the world of peacemaking really needs is something similar to what this man is named Mr. Steve Colbert, something similar to what they did to the world of poverty alleviation. So these two men, Steve Corbett and Bryant Fickert, a while ago, they wrote a book called When Helping Hurts. And there's a lot of research out there just going into how people, and when they're giving things away, have just really hurt the developing world with unintentionally, without really thinking about the things that they're doing. And after talking with Mr. Corbett, I feel really, really passionately that the world of peacemaking kind of needs a reawakening in general. And I know that many of you already have a two kingdoms frame, but I think that we have a lot of work to be doing to do the same thing they did, where they sort of went out and they said, hey, just giving people money isn't gonna solve all their problems. It's actually gonna hurt them in the long run. I've done a lot of talking with a man named Pablo Yoder. Hopefully he's not a stranger to some of you. I was able to go down and visit his church in Nicaragua, where I would say if I could point to one church who knows about peacemaking right now, it would be his church down in Nicaragua. It's in West Lala. It's called Hermandad Cristiana, and the stories that are coming out of there are truly amazing to me about how they have been able to take previous men of violence and to turn them into disciples of Christ on either sides of a conflict. If you're familiar with the situation in Nicaragua, you go to their church and you will find two men that used to be fighting against each other now in the same church. And I feel like we should be paying close attention to what they are doing down there. And then this is just an example of a book. If you Google like peacemaking or reconciliation, this man, Dr. Edgardo Emmerich at an institution called Duke, his book is what I would call sort of a very vanilla response to what the world is telling us to be reconciliation. And I just pulled a quote out of his book. So he says, the mission of the church is not just to save souls. The most robust understanding of reconciliation is one in which we need to be reconciled to God, but not God alone. Being reconciled with God empowers us to give us a task, being reconciled to each other and to all of creation. And I feel like that quote kind of embodies a lot of the general world of peacemaking, where the salvation of souls is almost a secondary endeavor in peacemaking. So when you go out and study, hey, what are the sources of the conflict that we're seeing around us here, whether it be violence, whether it be political polarization, a lot of people will now point to these sort of high level problems like social and economic inequality, political exclusion, corrupt governments. There's a book called Why Nations Fail, and it's basically saying all the problems of the world can be pointed to the corrupt institutions around us, environmental degradation from resource extraction. And so people are pointing at these things, and then they're saying that's why we have high crime rates, that's why we have gangs, ethnic clashes, poverty, refugees, that the underlying root causes of some of the world's problems are not spiritual. So the world, I would say in general, has misdiagnosed the problem. And that's why it's so relevant for us with a two kingdoms perspective to be reclaiming the problem statement, because if you misdiagnose the problem, then often you're going to be hacking at the you're trying to come up with solutions that just don't get to the root problem. And so what I wanted to just say is that when we've been reading a lot about peacemaking, peace building, the peace world, much of our research, what I would say on the x-axis, if you could put ourselves on two poles, a lot of our research has a low view of God, or a low view of the importance of God and their model of how to prescribe solutions to the world. And so I put myself on this researcher's side, where many of the people that I've been talking to, I'm trying to say, hey, I'm starting from a place where I think the relationship with God is the most essential relationship of humanity. And I think that many of you brothers on this call could agree to that our relationship with God should be elevated. And this is just an example of, I mentioned that When Helping Hurts book, where you look at some of the different poverty alleviations models, and many of those models are just trying to empower somebody to have a good relationship with himself. And then, but the authors come and say, hey, if you have a solution that doesn't reestablish someone's relationship with God, you've missed the point. And at the end, all your efforts will have been in vain, because if you sort of set someone who is poor on the right path out of poverty, but miss his relationship with God in the very end, it's not going to go well. And then on the other side of things, so the first axis I defined was the view of God. So a lot of our research, when you go out there, has a low view of God. I would say that God is maybe just an okay thing to believe in. On the other spectrum, or the vertical spectrum in this case, you see a lot of diversity about how people view their enemies. And what has been really interesting is, what I think, when you put those two questions together, how do you view God in your relationships, and how do you view enemies, that you can kind of get four broad categories of peacemaking. And what I am trying to argue in all of my presentations is that true peacemaking has a high view of God, important to relationships, and also a high view of enemies, that your enemies are actually very important to include in your worldview of how you're trying to reconcile people and your models. So when you map those two questions out, you can imagine getting so is God central in your core relationships, and are enemies central in the core relationships, sort of your model of peacemaking? If the answer to both those questions is yes, that you get this sacrificial view of peacemaking, which I think is lacking in the world. I don't think there are many people doing it. And then you kind of get these three other models where maybe enemies are very important in the core set of relationships, but God isn't. So in the top left, I would call that something called globalism or liberalism. So right now, many of you might be paying attention to the electoral politics in the United States. There's actually quite a significant portion of people in the liberal camp who kind of fall into this, where they kind of like the idea of peacemaking. And if I were to tell them that I left the military for reasons of conscience, they'd be like, "Oh man, that's really cool. Good for you." But when I tell them God is the most important relationship, that's where they sort of balk, and they say, I'm going to stay away from your religion. And then these other two models, if God is not included and enemies are not included, that's classically called something called realism. And then where people just kind of don't believe in God, and they believe that basically security is the main part of life, that is realism. And then what I think the Christian world, many of you know, has experienced is that the teaching of love of enemies has sort of disappeared over the course of time as the church has married the state, which what I call is Christian realism, where the answer is God is important, but enemies no longer get mapped in here. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to map out these four quadrants. I'll say them again. So sacrificialism is the view that I think is the view we should be moving towards. Globalism is the view where enemies are important, but Godism isn't. Realism is this view where neither God nor your enemies are important. And then Christian realism is what I would say would be characterized by the Christian right now, a lot of the times, where God is very important, but your enemies sort of get left behind, and they're sort of the target of a lot of just violence, or generally saying, I'm not going to respect you if you're my enemy. So in realism here, we have the most important being is yourself, and then as you move out from those relationships, you can see that your neighbor's kind of important, the state around you is important, others might be important, other people, but and if you could see this diagram right here, so dotted lines represent relationships that can be reconciled, and solid lines represent relationships that can't be reconciled. So in realism, you sort of get the self-contained group where people are most concerned about their own security, but their enemies, those are the people that most threaten them, so they're never going to be reconciled. A great example of a realist is a man named, or a martyr in the realist camp is a man named Pat Tillman. So Pat Tillman, it was an NFL player who, after 9/11, left his career of stardom, joined the Marines, and then went and served and was killed as a martyr for the things he believed in and his view of how to make peace. It's very interesting how many of these views of peacemaking also have martyrs associated with them. Next up, we just have this Christian realism. So Christian realism is what I would say the predominant view right now among Christians in America, where if you ask someone what is most important to you, one might say, you might hear words like freedom or liberty, like just let me live my life and let me be. And here, people will usually say that God is the most important person in these relationships, but out from God, you can see that the self, the next relationship that is most important, self, maybe the neighbors, the state, others, people within that. And Christian realists, they sort of they put themselves in a hard camp, because they will kill their enemies, and they'll say that we can promote violence against our enemies, but we could also convert them in another world. So I feel like there's a really hard view in this Christian realist camp to try to move, where people will say, no, I think my enemies, I could convert them to God, but if they're against me, I have no problem with eliminating them. But so they kind of exist in a hard world from my perspective. Some of you might be familiar, just as an example, as a Christian realist. This man, its name is David Eubank. He started an organization called Free Burma Rangers, and he's actually a previous man in the U.S. Army, and I had a chance just to talk with him briefly for about an hour about his mission. And so now you get examples of, I would say, really well-meaning people who are risking their lives for the security. In this picture, you can see him holding a little girl, rescuing her from wartime rubble. But if you zoom out, there will be the Free Burma Rangers will carry weapons, and so they're sort of trying to secure souls and eliminate enemies at the same time. So you get sort of a really interesting view of peacemaking from an example like Dave Eubank with the Free Burma Rangers. And then this view right here, the next one, is called globalism. And globalism is a really interesting mentality right now, because what I've found is once you talk about Jesus's teachings on loving your enemies and turning the other cheek, they will very rapidly applaud you, and they'll be like, that is an amazing teaching. I hope you promote that. But really, in the center, one of the most important things to a globalist or a liberalist is just humanity in general. So when I was down at EMU, I paid really close attention to sort of the language that teachers were using, that EMU is Eastern Mennonite University. Teachers were using, the heads of the school were using, and it was very interesting. I even was able to give a presentation on Sattler College, and their main critique of Sattler's model, they said, hey, how are you going to recruit a Muslim to your school, and where is there room for all these other religions? And it seems like you've missed out on humanity. And I didn't hear Christ one time in like my entire time there, and I spent I've taken around 9 classes from there. And so what you end up happening with globalism is humanity is important, self and others is important, enemies are sort of in it, and the state is, but on the outside you sort of have there's a question mark here about, hey, what is it, what is our mission here? And I would say a globalist is just trying to promote equality among humanity and sort of establish a model where everybody's working hand in hand with each other. And such an example of a really well-meaning globalist. So this man's name is Michael Sharp. He comes from a liberal Mennonite background, and he actually became a UN peacekeeper. And then he was actually shot and killed in the Congo, or the DRC, as a mission to promote Christian peacemaking in a civil war in the Congo. So we see another example of a person willing to become a martyr for their model of peacekeeping. And I think if you read about his story, it's pretty inspirational. I would say, he gave up everything, and he actually was with another person who was decapitated, and they were just there trying to stop a civil war in the Congo. But this was born out of this belief of humanity being reconciled and that being very important. But God is sort of absent from the picture. And then this last one is what I have called sacrificialism. And this is what I think in general the peacemaking world has to go towards in order to have any success. So in this model, you'll begin to see sort of a little bit of a semblance of 2 kingdoms here, where the relationship with God is the most important relationship in the center. But when you look at it, God, if you look at this from your own lens, you're actually on the outside of this relationship, where a sacrificialist says, hey, my neighbors and others, and even my own enemies, their relationship with God is more important than my own. I think that biblically you end up being very inspired by men like Paul and Moses are the 2 examples. You hear them crying to God, and you hear them saying, God, if only the people would be reconciled to you, I'll give up my own salvation. You hear Moses say this, you hear Paul say this, where we're actually less important than the people around us, even our own enemies. And in this model, I'll try to put it all together here shortly. The state or the governments cannot be reconciled to God, which is a very, very, very important frame of mind to switch. You see this, I mentioned these dotted lines. I'm trying to put in these 2 kingdom notions here, that in this model, we can take out individuals from the state and bring them to God and have them reconciled to God, but we can't reconcile the state itself. And that's a very 2 kingdoms-esque principle. But I believe that peacemaking should be born from this very notion that people are more important than ourselves, and that God is at the very center, and that redemption is the most important thing that we're after. And unfortunately, I'm very new to the world of peacemaking, about 3 years old, but I don't know of very many martyrs in this worldview that I can point to or that I've heard of. I've heard a lot of stories about, I put a picture up of Dirk Willems here, of this story of him running away and saving sort of his captor. And you do hear really inspirational stories like Pablo Yoder and Ken Miller down and being thrown in prison. But I've yet to come across a story of one martyr in our lifetime who has sacrificially given their life for their view of peacemaking. And this is something that has started to bother me a little, where I feel like if we truly believe in the message to be peacemakers in the world that we're surrounded with, that in our circles, we should have a high number of people we know who are sacrificially going and elevating the security of others above themselves. And so when you put it all together here, I tried to come up with a motto that best captures each of these views here. So the realist will say, as much blood as necessary. I will spill as much blood as I can to promote my own security. The just war theorist, who is born out of the Christian realist camp, will say, do you know what? As much blood as is just, I'll shed as much blood, and it'll be a just cause. And you see a lot of people making these sort of arguments about how much blood is they're willing to shed for the sake of freedom and liberty and God's justice. And the globalist, they'll actually say, even though I said they have a high view of their enemies, many times you will find them saying as little blood as possible. We're about peace and enemies, but when it comes to self-defense or something like that, if you press a globalist or somebody there on their view of others and their enemies, they'll say, you know what, as little blood as possible, but I'd still probably promote self-defense. And in each of these worlds, you see that I've labeled their primary mechanism of the pursuit of human security. So in the realist camp, people just wage war. That has been the classic way to wage war from a realist perspective and to promote security. That's no surprise. In the Christian realist camp, people wage just war, because now they've included God in their model, and they say, hey, God is on our side, therefore we can promote justice. In the globalist camp, I would say what the word that you will hear is peace building. And I've actually tried really hard to understand the difference between peace building and peacemaking. And they'll say as little blood as possible, but you will still find them saying that the bloodshed of some humans is okay, which is, I was very surprised to find people in that camp. And then the mantra that I think we should just I'm beginning to try to become obsessed with, is the sacrificialism mantra, which is just no blood but our own, where we will love our enemies, but we will also not make decisions where we won't be able to shed our own blood, where you see these stories of these other martyrs like Pat Tillman, like Michael Sharp, and the countless people who are going and promoting their worldview. I feel like in our lifetime, I hope that we get another generation of martyrs who are peacemakers, being willing to really to say no blood but our own, where we will love our enemies, but we'll be willing to elevate the importance of another soul over our own security for their redemption. And I've just been very inspired by the potential that a lot of our churches have. I am so convinced that in our lifetime we can raise a generation of people who will be peacemakers and will go into the world and will kind of refuse to have a worldview where the state can be reconciled to God here. And I'll close here shortly, but just some of the implications and next steps. It's 2020 right now, and in any peacemaking that is not latched on to prayer is, I just think so. We're not going to have success without prayer, and so I've been kind of rallying around some students here and some different brothers to just start praying about the places in the world that are experiencing conflict that we can get into. I would also say that some next steps are to start reordering the priorities of the two kingdoms model, or the kingdom churches, where we will start to, I would say, reorder our priority of relationships, where God is at the center, but other people, I feel like sometimes we selfishly begin to put our own salvation closer to God rather than the salvation of our enemies or even our neighbors and other people living within our circles. And then just in general, I think that in the world of peacemaking, we should see a lot of efforts to build unity in churches. And then in 2020 and beyond, some of the things that I'll be trying to really wrap my mind around here in Boston is organizing, recruiting, and training peacemakers who will then go out and begin church planting in violent communities with a mentality of permanence and sacrifice, knowing that they are packing their belongings and in their coffins as the Christians of old, the martyrs of old, with no expectation of safety or security. And I really hope that we begin to see another generation who, in our lifetime, the martyr ratios will flip, and that each one of us will be able to point to a tangible example of followers of Christ who who have elevated the importance of others above themselves. And I pray that in our lives, that the people we're training and discipling, we can say, you will lay it all on the line for Christ, or he'll come back before you have to. And that will just be our general mentality moving forward. And so I'd love to just open it up for questions and discussion. I know I sort of covered a lot of ground there and tried to present and summarize the world of peacemaking as I understood it in these two axes about view of God and view of enemies. And I know that is giving me a little bit of comfort to try to drift into this top right corner of sacrificialism and from a two kingdoms perspective. And I'll stop sharing my screen here so I can see everyone.
Okay. Thank you for the challenge, Zach. Wow. I recently, there's a movie that came out on the Free Burma Rangers.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's captured the hearts of lots of people, young people especially, because that's just that, obviously we all love that challenge, right? To go put ourselves on the line for good, right? And of course, it has the edge of, carrying an assault rifle and taking out the bad guy. And it's really tangible. And I know there's a lot of young people who that's captured their interest. Just last evening, I had a young man from Oregon, telling me about some of the things that have been happening there in their community, with the arsonists, supposedly arsonists. I'm not sure if that's, just some of the conspiracy theories that have been going around and the different sides that are pushing this, but starting fires and right in Mennonite communities. And, these Mennonites owned lots of land, and basically the police are saying, if you see an arsonist, you can shoot him, no questions asked. And they actually had I'm not saying the Mennonites were part of this, but there was groups of men out, putting up roadblocks. I mean, it was aggressive, and it was by the people. it was their neighbors that were doing this. And it's just so easy for our hearts to get pulled into these things. Your blood boils and you want to set things right. And so definitely an applicable message for our day in so many ways. I might have some more thoughts to share later, but yeah, thanks for sharing, brother.
Of course. Yeah, I wanted to mention, I got a chance to speak. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, the names are escaping me, but there's a man from a Mennonite background who interacted with the Free Burma Rangers. Does anyone know the name?
Is it Daryl Yoder?
Daryl Yoder, and one of the Rangers showed up at his wedding and pinned him on with that little medal. I don't know if anyone saw that video of, the tension between a sacrificialist and a Christian realist is it's very palpable, because we both believe in God and are going about it in a very different way. And what's terrifying to me is that, I had a conversation with this Free Burma Ranger guy, and he was like, you have very convincing arguments about your love for enemies, but show me somebody that's doing it. Like,
Right.
show me a model that I can plug into, that I can take my passion and go into it. And it's hard to point at things other than to say, hey, church planning here, church planning there. So I feel like this is just the start of trying to build some sort of model that we can inspire people to join. Not that the churches aren't important, but I think a model is ripe to be built in our world.
Well, I really enjoyed that talk, Zach, and you put a lot of things in a really clear manner there for us to think about. Had a question on the idea of not knowing of many martyrs from the sacrificialist camp. So I kind of see the Christian camp is divided in a certain way between people who have a very strong theological basis for sacrificialism, and they've thought out or inherited an idea of two kingdoms. So we can maybe say Mennonites are in that category, or at least two kingdom Mennonites, for example. And then there's a lot of people out there, be that maybe from Protestant backgrounds, who don't have a developed theology, but in their life they make personal choices because they're following the Bible. So an example, like Nate Saint, Jim Elliott, his 5 men down in, I guess it was Ecuador, I can't remember for sure. Before they went to South America, they met with some Anabaptists and they talked about non-resistance. Now, I don't know if they fully developed that in their minds, but at some point they decided, we're going to go to this tribe without weapons because we don't want to be tempted. And then, there's much more recent examples of people in Muslim countries who say, well, I'm not going to defend myself because I'm going to be a martyr for the gospel. Do they fit into your quest for martyrs or not?
Yeah, so the first time I give this presentation, I did include Nate Saint and Jim Elliott. I don't know if you know my background. I was a missionary kid in Ecuador, spent 18 years in Ecuador. My parents went down to Ecuador following the example of the saints. We gave tours of their homes. I think I've given a tour of Nate Saint's house upwards of 50 times to different people visiting. So that story is very special to my heart. And I do put them into the sacrificialist model of living without coming from a church that stands for it. And, I think one of the things that I'm passionate about is that in discipleship, we are discipling people to become like Christ. And I think they had it right. But when they called people into the church, what church are they calling people into to live afterwards? And that's where I feel like they're at this 80%, this 80% model. But then they did have rifles, so they brought rifles and they had them in their house and all that. So they left the rifles behind to go evangelize. And a lot of my friends are kind of in this camp too, that are still in the Air Force. At least my Christian friends, they'll say, I wear 2 hats. When I put on my uniform and when I take off my uniform, then I go evangelize. Those are 2 different roles I play. And in one role, I'll be using violence, and in the other, I won't. And I feel like that's kind of what I would view is they kind of flip-flop or teeter between those 2 camps, if you can imagine, in different scenarios. But the Nate Saint story, I think, is an incredible, an amazing story that I think if we tweaked it a little bit and then train people in that in the future, I feel like the ripple effects could be incredible. If you can imagine just 10 groups of Nate Saint like people organizing and going and trying to reach people like that. But yeah, I love the Nate Saint story, and I would give credit to them. I just what's left afterwards is what I think is very important. And there is no non-resistant church in Ecuador. I know this because I know this because I was part of the community that came after that movement.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Zach, for sharing. Your model on sacrificialism, I was surprised. I wasn't expecting the order of God, others, self, neighbor, and God, others, enemies, and self, or however that goes in. And I was just thinking about our personal Christian life of striving toward God. We have to deal with ourself and enemies before we can reach God, and kind of that idea of as we strive for God, we also are bringing enemies and others toward him as well. So that was very inspirational, and just the whole topic of non-resistance. I feel like we as Christians in America, we're going to be having to deal with that more, as that example out in Oregon. So yeah, thanks for that inspiration.
Amen. I feel like it's one of the great paradoxes in Christianity that I think Jesus points to often, that if we lose our lives, we'll find it. If we find our lives, we'll lose it. And I think that order is trying to capture that notion a little bit. I like your name, by the way, Zach.
Yeah, just Zach, your challenge is right. You're basically giving this a majority of this group, is Anabaptist background, and you're saying, brothers, where have you all been? And it's legitimate. It really is legitimate, because we have as a people, we've kind of found a sweet spot here in America where we can kind of do our thing, and we're not we're not. The government says, hey, actually, the Amish, at Trump's rally the other day, there was this phrase being passed around online: "Make quilts great again." I mean, there's Amish are known for their quilts, and the world knows it, right? They know that they're artisans when it comes to building stuff by hand, and so may we make the kingdom great again. And I really appreciate that challenge.
And I hope the tone doesn't come off as I'm pointing fingers, as opposed to like, hey, let's mobilize and go. There's nothing stopping us. This summer, I don't know if I got a time. I was actually trying to apply some of this stuff in Minneapolis during the George Floyd riots, and I was shocked by the lack of a non-resistant worldview in the riots. I don't know if any of you paid attention to. I'm sure all of you were paying attention, but there's people begging for the answer that we already have in what the solution to a lot of these problems are. And I feel like this summer we saw the worst of a lot of these worlds clashing in my mind, where the polar side of the right was coming, and you got these just war guys coming out in their sort of militia type stances, and then we get the globalists who are all about equality coming out, and they're rioting and burning things down. And I felt like the Christian bridge was it's so I don't want to say obvious to me, but once you believe these things, you look at these people and you're like, if you only knew what Christ had for you, and if you only knew his teachings, then none of this would be happening. And I just feel like it's a state of sort of mourning that we should be in, but I didn't really have the right answers. Like I was there, but it's like, what on earth does a non-resistant church, what's our role in these places, if anything? I don't know if I still haven't settled if we had a big role to play this summer that we missed or something like that.
Zach, I really appreciated your presentation there. A lot of conceptual frameworks that I haven't really been spending time thinking about, and it's going to take me a little bit to digest it. When you had those 4 models mapped in circles in an Punnett square, is that diagram something that you could put out on a chat? You'd be willing for people to pore over, or do you not consider it developed enough for that?
I feel like I have a few changes that I want to make to it, but I'd be happy to share it to the chat if that's something you'd be interested in. Some of the academic terms people have been challenging me, but it's good critique if you'd be interested in seeing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd just be interesting and something to continue to pour over.
Of course,
then
I'd
also,
love to send it.
I had a question. So practically speaking, for those of us who already have our theological construct, our worldview embraces a lot of this sacrificial concept toward the world, but we're not actively promoting that to the world. What are some practical ideas of how we could mobilize? Are you thinking just get in the way of evil, like go where the riots are happening and get involved in trying to talk to people? Or
Yeah, I think my call at the end there was church planting in places that don't have kingdom churches, but so I think that's what I'm trying to plan out for my future. But something that I've been doing with this presentation specifically is I'll try to build that chart, and I'll try to put it in front of someone a Christian who disagrees with me, because I actually think dialoguing with professing Christians is massively important in our lifetimes, because I'm not going to try to make any judgment calls about people's salvation and whether or not what churches will lead to heaven. But I have found a lot of good dialogue around this model about just like, hey, where would you map yourself on this diagram of view of enemies and view of God? Like, I put myself here. You can imagine using it as a map and then trying to tease out other people's beliefs theologically. That's been the thing that just an easy, like during the COVID world, I just called people that disagreed with me and we had an hour-long talk about it. And usually that ends up being a beneficial conversation. You can imagine a lot of interesting things flowing out of this. I'll give you one example. Are you guys familiar with Messiah College in where is that?
It's in Grantham, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's an author there who wrote a book called Disarming the Church, and his name is Eric Siebert. And the front title of his book is, a revolver that's been tied into a knot. And I read his book and I said, hey, I read it. I read your book. Would you mind discussing your view on two kingdoms? And, he wanted really bad to be in the sacrificialist camp, but his book called for much more political involvement than I think a lot of us would be comfortable with. And he said, at the end of it, he said, I wish more than anything you would put me in this top right quadrant, but I think you would put me in this globalist quadrant. And I said, I was like, I think you're right. But it was a great dialogue over just this question of the state involvement at that point. And I think us winning over other churches and unifying churches is going to be a really important step as well, Truman. Even, locally here, I feel like it's not just the, obviously it's not just the violence that we're trying to go into. We're trying to win over people. We're trying to win that Christian realist camp too, in my mind. and building bridges into all these worlds is something that might look different.
Hey, can I put a color view into this?
Of course.
Okay, I have a guy, everybody knows I run a halfway house for sex offenders. I have a guy next door and he hates us. He hates what we're doing. He hates everything about us. He tells everybody who walks by, there's pedophiles over there. And after months and months and months of trying to soothe his anger with many different things, there just came a day where he yelled at me, come back here, I'll beat your brains in. And I said, why are you going to run back there? Come right here and let's do it. And I got face to face with him. And when he told me he was going to beat me up, I said, go ahead. I will not call the police and I will not strike you back. And when you hit me, I will get back up and allow you to hit me again. Now, that I directly confronted his anger. He has not spoke to me. He won't look at me anymore. He hasn't yelled. He hasn't said anything wrong. And he kind of like, I've taken all the juice out of his sails. Is that a blue collar approach?
I'm not sure.
My name is Carlin High from the phone call. Can you hear me?
Yes, Carlin.
Zach, with your can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
With your Air Force background, Zach, would you be familiar with names like John Boyd or William S. Lind and the moral level of war?
I know John Boyd well. No, I did not know the second name. Boyd is taught.
William S. Lind he popularized John Boyd's idea of the moral level of war.
Mhm.
He says there's 3 levels: the physical, the mental, and the moral. Which the physical is obvious. The mental would be more like psychological or propaganda when you're trying to convince the other side that they can't win.
Mhm.
The moral level is more convincing the other side that they are in the wrong and that they should not win. More like, say, and he points to this as the reason why the United States has lost almost every armed conflict since Vietnam, because they end up being seen as the oppressor. And so the story we just heard there about the man who was always angry at the halfway house people, I heard him saying like the moral level as, instead of out fighting the other person, you are taking the fight out of them. And I was fascinated to learn that this William S. Lind man is neighbors and friends with David Klein, an Amish farmer who has spoken at Anabaptist Identity Conference. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was any influence there with that idea he's pushing. So yeah, it's just something that I had heard about, and it fascinated me because I almost, hearing his idea of how that moral level of war works, sounded almost resonated with the non-resistance teachings I grew up hearing. So yeah, thanks for your presentation.
Is a local view. I'm not into the global.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Zach, for sharing. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on your choice of words between peacemaking versus non-resistance.
Yeah, I think I intentionally used the word sacrificialism as opposed to non-resistance, because generally at this point, I think non-resistance is a little too passive. We're often grouped in the pacifist camp, and that's something that really, 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 really bothers me, is that I don't think any of us would call ourselves pacifists, and I think non-resistance kind of has been swallowed by the pacifist word in general. And so when I think with all of you brothers, it's easy. I think non-resistance is understood more easily. But if I'm talking to somebody and I say non-resistance, that usually it's like the pacifist. I also avoided the word pacifism here. I could have used that as well. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, I agree with that. It's something I've often argued for, the term that Jesus uses about peace. But yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and it also bothers me that the peace building world has, in my mind, the peace building being this other sort of the EMU world, they've sort of stolen peacemaking in my mind, where I say, hey, what motivates you? And they're like, humanity rather than Christ. So I feel like we have a little bit of work to sort of reclaim peacemaking from a Christ level motivation, if that makes sense, and to differentiate between peace building and peacemaking in general in terms of Sermon on the Mount peacemaking.
Oh, hi,
Sure.
Zach.
And Zach. Hey, go ahead, Wendell.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that was really helpful to me. Your differentiation between the globalist perspective and what you're calling this globalist and the sacrificialist, because I've heard too some of the same things that I believe coming out of their mouths, but yet looking at the way it's worked out, and I like your focus on what, or your thoughts about what the focus is there, and that humanity is their focus rather than Jesus Christ. And I think that's very helpful to me in understanding the differences there between the two top sectors of your different comparisons. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah, Zach, have you heard the term ideal resistance? John D. Martin has kind of pushed that notion. There's actually an episode that, if you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend listening to it. I love that idea. And Leo Eby has been promoting that for 10 years. So
the ideal resistance. I have heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea. And then just a little note here. I'm part of the prayer, the 24-hour prayer chain thing that's going on. That's called Eternal Prayer Flames. And recently, one of the emails they put out, it was a note that said this: an Anabaptist brother recently did a survey and learned that there are at least 9 plain conferences or fellowships in the Anabaptist world in which members in good standing are carrying concealed handguns to church. And I find that unbelievable. Disgusting.
Yeah, I don't want to point. I've been generally surprised that there's, I'll just call it a sort of a closet Republican.
Right.
There's a little bit of that going on for people arguing for gun rights, and it's like I don't understand what. Yeah, but we have a little bit of work there.
Amen.
Maybe this is getting too far off topic, but I listened to your message a few weeks ago about taking extreme ownership.
Oh yeah.
And I enjoyed that. Of course, you didn't want to criticize your dad, but the example that you gave in the message was your dad taking extreme ownership of a situation through non-peacemaking means. And I don't remember if you fully developed like how you can take extreme ownership through peacemaking, but in your mind, does that look like what Patrick Matthews described? Like how do these two things, taking extreme ownership and peacemaking, flow together?
Yeah, I think I love Patrick's stories here. If any of you ever have time to listen to another interview I do with Pablo Yoder, it's on Followers of the Way channel. I don't know if any of you have heard him tell his stories about how he and his family react in violent examples. I feel like there's this third way. It's the third way reaction that is taking extreme ownership, where you'll step into something and reject violence from the very beginning, as sort of being like, if I run into a situation, I'm gonna get involved, but I'm not gonna use violence, and find this other third way example. I feel like that's how I would mix them. And I think Pablo he is the person that I know that has the most examples of taking extreme ownership of a situation, and still following the ways of Christ, and just having like really amazing outcomes. And unfortunately, I don't think we're promised that, but that I would point to sort of his life as just the prime example of of going somewhere and interacting with people who the day before cut somebody's hand off, and now they're in your house, and you're serving them coffee so they don't rob you. It's kind of an amazing example of Christ's love being able to permeate other people's lives. I don't know if that satisfies your question, Philip.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
But until you practically do it, it's all a theoretical practice. Question, which one? I'm on your website for Followers of the Way. Which one am I looking for to put up on our chat so people can listen to this? The one with Pablo?
Yeah, let me, it's on YouTube. It's actually on YouTube. I'm not sure if it's on our website. It's on YouTube.
Zach, you could just drop it on the WhatsApp channel when you get a
yeah.
chance there.
I'll do that.
Okay, it's a few minutes after the hour. Thank you all for your participation and dialogue. We do have another announcement yet, but maybe Zach, if you want to lead us in prayer, and then we'll follow that with an announcement.
Of course. Father, I am very grateful for these brothers who have joined in the waking hours of the morning just to think about you and your son and the ways he's called us to in our lifetime. Father, I do pray over everybody's life here that we could just be chasing your son's second coming, Lord, and that we could just say, we can ask ourselves, how can we get him here? How can we hasten Christ's coming? How can we follow in his ways? And I pray for wisdom and the different ways and the different projects that all of us are involved in. Father, please bless our work, and may we have success where you would have us have it, and failure where we are not amplifying your glory. And in your son's name, amen.
Amen. So thank you again, Zach, for sharing. You're welcome here anytime.
Thank you.
We have not done well in the past of announcing what's on for next week. Brian, do you have something to share of what's planned for next week?
Yeah, I have my friend Sam Bear on here. Good morning, Sam. I see you're on there. And Sam, he might have the most commitment of all of us. He's from Calgary, Alberta. And so he's about, what, 2 hours behind us here, Sam, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so he is up at 4 o'clock to be on this call. So good to have you here, brother. Sam has quite a story to share of his life, and recently coming back to God, and he and his wife choosing to really commit themselves to the way of Jesus, and just amazing work in their lives there. And I asked him to share here next Saturday morning. So we'll look forward to that, Sam. So
all right.
Good to have you on the call.
All
Anybody else 2 hours 2 hours earlier? You might be the only one. You need to start recruiting some more people from the West there, brother.
Yeah. Just keep in mind next weekend, it is going to be 4 a.m. So if it's not, the thoughts don't come together that well, then that's why.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and may the Lord bless your week.
As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend.